from the drill and ceremony in the march. It's clearly from the treatment that we're seeing these effects. Because traditionally the programs that were the basic boot camps showed absolutely none negative. Some have added treatment, and some do it fairly well, and you'll get some effects with that if you add some aftercare. But it's not from the boot camp element. It's clear in the data that that's the case. You have to be careful, especially with boot camps, because if you don't screen appropriately, those kind of programs often take, they mix low, high, and low, medium, and high risk together, and then they bond it into groups. And we call those gangs in Ohio. I don't know what we call them. And the other problem is, especially with the traditional boot camp, the social learning that's being modeled is aggressive behavior. Because the first thing they do when they get off the bus is somebody bigger and stronger gets in their face and tells them, I'm going to straighten you out. And what these kids learn very quickly is you want to get somebody to do what you want, just get in their face. So there's a lot of reasons that model, theoretically, was just seriously flawed. It just never worked. By the way, lack of discipline and leadership are not criminogenic risk factors. I see programs all the time that say, we're going to teach them discipline, we're going to teach them leadership. And I'm always thinking, what's that got to do with criminal behavior? In fact, gangs need discipline and leadership. It's not a big risk factor. So another one? Yes.
So I wonder if you might say anything about sex offenders, because here in Michigan, I don't know how this is applied, but everybody seems to lose their mind when you mention sex offending behavior.
Yeah.
And it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that on balance, most juvenile sex offenders don't reoffend again, or at least they don't, there's a small group of them who do. And then on balance, we completely overreact in those.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fair statement. Juvenile sex offenders are a little different than adults in that we believe about half aren't really sex offenders. They're simply kids that were experimenting, in the behavior. In terms of, and so the principles actually, we've seen it in the data. You target higher risk sex offenders, not low risk sex offenders. When you mix them together, you get negative effects. In terms of treatment effects, you're right, they tend to have low baselines of failure, but most sex offenders, new crime is not necessarily a sex offender, right? Which tells us they have a lot of criminogenic risk factors there that are often going on. In fact, in terms of interventions, there's really only cognitive behavioral treatment for sex offenders. The other modalities don't tend to work very well. But you're right, it's an emotional one. Everybody gets up in arms. You've got sex offenders, we post them. In Ohio, we're the second state to pass the Walsh Act for juvenile. The effect it had was just the opposite. Our number of sex offenders has dropped like a rock because they're not being brought into court anymore. Most of these were families or therapists that were reporting these kids for treatment. And now the fear of going on the list for 10 years has meant they're not bringing in their kids. So we've seen it looks like the stock market when it dropped. I mean, the line just goes straight down. And we think it was actually an unintended consequence of passing this very restrictive law that results. Now, we don't have fewer sex offenders. We just have fewer kids coming into court and getting treatment. All right. I'm probably out of time. My other timekeeper is, okay, one more.
That 200 hours.
Yeah.
I heard you speak.
Guideline. Yeah.
I heard it a lot. It's very daunting because when you really take the program apart, how many hours truly in a week are they getting that cognitive behavioral change?
Yeah.
And even if you had a residential program that did that 10 hours a week or 20 weeks, it's still a 6-month program, and a lot of us don't have that. So what's the answer for that?
What's the answer? Well, it's not an easy one. We designed a program in Ohio, institutional program. We were told you can only have your kids 100, 120 days. Our goal, I told my staff, I don't want these kids failing because they did not get enough treatment. We solved the problem. They do a group every day. And on weekends, the correctional staff go facilitate groups. It was the only way, because these kids are in school 5.5 hours, they got to eat, they got to have recreation. You can't do 5 hours a day, and even if you have the time, they're kids. So we had to space it out and use the whole week, and we did. But it's a challenge. I'm not going to kid you. But let me say this, not every kid needs 200 hours. And so you've got to adjust your program. I was here in Lansing, and the juvenile court here has a alternative school day reporting program. And for the day reporting program, what they do is high-risk kids come Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 4 to 8. Moderate risk kids come Tuesday and Thursday. So with one scheduling change, they increased the dosage for high-risk kids, and they kept them separated. So you have to be creative. I don't have an easy answer other than to take a hard look at your schedule. When I go through schedules, what I often see is a lot of stuff you're doing that really isn't going to get you.
Is there a duration of 200 hours over a certain amount of time?
No, I think the caveat is most studies show when treatment goes beyond 12 months, duration-wise, we see drops in effects. Okay, so that would be but that wouldn't apply to sex offenders, for example. There are some exceptions to that. But if you have 3 months to work with a kid, you don't have to do all those hours either. It may be a continuum of care. So when the youth gets out, there may be more treatment going on. But do not. I remember I looked at a girls program in Oregon once, and it was a 6-month program. The girls were in the program, 24/7. When you stripped it down, they did 4 hours a week of what I consider to be evidence-based program. And all the rest was crap. Well, here's the problem. 9 out of 10 of those girls were high risk. And so I'm looking at a program that's delivering about half of the treatment they need to get. And there really wasn't much excuse for it. You could have easily doubled that 8 hours. You can't do 8 hours a week. You can do that in a 6-month period. So we just have to, I think we have to be, what the data is clearly telling us is we can't have a one-size program. Kids aren't high risk because they have a risk factor. They're high risk because they have a number of risk factors. And so we can't design unidimensional programs, and we can't, if you want to get effects, you've got to make sure that you meet those kind of requirements. Yes?
What kind of data do you collect and share with policymakers and local officials to influence improvements in the systems for kids?
What kind of data? Most of my work focuses on outcome data, recidivism data. We look at obviously intermediate measures, whether the kids are doing better in school, whether their drug tests are going down. But at the end of the day, it's usually about, are we in fact changing their behavior? That's the kind of work I do. I don't, let me say this, I don't try to change systems. I gave up on that a long time ago. I try to fix programs. If I can take a program and teach them how to do a better job with kids, I sleep good at night. In fact, I try to stay away from politicians as a rule. I came here because Esther bugged me all the time. But I think it is important at a policy level. The judge pointed out some of the problems, some of the things that prevent Michigan in some ways from doing the right thing. And I think you have to look at that, and you have to say, hey, are we assessing kids? In Ohio, for example, what the state said is if you commit a kid, you've got to do this assessment. All right? Yeah, sure.
The other thing that you need to keep in mind about assessment is some of these kids are under court jurisdiction for parts of more than 1 year. The example I always use is recidivism. If you report that your court collected $15,000 in restitution, if you collected $15,000 in restitution in 2010, that's data, that's not information. You have to track the kid who may have started in June and got discharged in February and find out how much restitution that one kid paid, and then aggregate that.
Yeah. Because John, you've got to have data, you've got to have individual level data. Aggregate data doesn't tell you that much. It doesn't tell you who's working with which kid, how that kid's doing. At the end of the day, the Ohio system, when we created it, it's been about a year now, we have like 20,000 kids in that system. We can tell you what risk factors they have, we can match it to program data. And so what I was excited about wasn't the assessment piece, but rather getting this data so that if a judge in Cleveland says this is a high-risk kid, we know what that means in Cincinnati because we're doing the same assessment. And so that's what got me excited about it. It's a non-proprietary system, so I know we train Michigan, it's basically free, folks can use it. But that was the real goal, was to get that data. And because truly evidence-based organizations are data-driven. You're not going to become evidence-based simply because you go get some MST or some other program. You're going to be evidence-based because you're using data to constantly look at what you're doing, like the judge does, and tries to see if you're getting the effects. All right, I've got to let